Oh look, we're back to the Moffat era. Hurrah. And to Series 8 no less, that fun collection of stupid and annoying. This one has been an episode I've always thought of as one of the better ones of that series though. In fact, I'd probably put it in second place, albeit a very distant one, to Mummy and the Orient Express. And while I do mostly stand by that, this is nevertheless an extremely frustrating episode. Because, well, it's two episodes in one. One that's actually pretty good, and one that's just absolutely god-awful. Guess which involves the mysterious and deliberately vague threat which interweaves with exploration of primal fear, and guess which involves Clara's love life with a war criminal. You get one guess. Now, to be fair to the episodes, there is not enough of plot A to fill the episode out, and putting my predisposals to dislike the character aside, having character stuff with a primary companion to fill it out that link back to the primary plot, that's a fine idea, and honestly I can't think of another more effective way to do it. The problem is that the primary companion is as unlikable as she ever is. The actual stuff she does is boring, stupid, and unentertaining. She has more chemistry with her mirror than she does with the actual target of her affections. He's a war criminal. There isn't really any actual character stuff that gets achieved. Her arc is she goes from liking him a bit to liking him a bit more, with some few arguments along the way, without any real change in the character as she does it. And, oh yeah, he's a war criminal. The episode does a lot right, and I can't call it a bad one. But so much of it is just utter dead air, focusing on a relationship I don't care about, one of whom I actively object to being a free man, and the other of whom is Clara, no more needs to be said, and the whole feeling that none of it is really going anywhere. It's a pity because it does mean the stronger stuff in plot A does feel like it needed stronger material to supplement it to really shine, so ultimately the episode is a disappointment because of that. But let's look into detail at why. Let's face it, we'd all like it if the videos were only 2 minutes long, but that would just be laziness on my part, wouldn't it? Anyway, Listen was directed by Douglas McKinnon, who we last saw work of whom when we looked at Time Heist earlier this year. This was obviously made in the same block as Time Heist. Time Heist was a bit of a weird and ultimately unsatisfying job on his part. I'm happy to say that this episode is quite a bit stronger on his part, and I think that's because the structure of the episode is better suited to the kind of things he was doing here. The best scene in the episode is the one in the room in the children's home when they have their backs to the maybe monster, and I'll examine exactly why more closely later on, but much of it is McKinnon's efforts, who keeps it close and personal as it should be, which does a great job of adding to the tension of the scene. I also like the mixing of a lot of the scenes, like when the Doctor's explaining the concepts, the pre-title sequence, or when he's explaining the dreams to Clara. It's stuff that in theory is just exposition, but is added to by the more dynamic presentation of it. Hell, even the opening shot, which is silly in theory, not sure when this bubble around the TARDIS got added, but it seems like a very plot or at least cool image-specific feature, nevertheless tracks very well and leaves an impression. There are some moments which don't work as well and come across a little sillier, but ultimately I think he does a good job of realising this one. The rest of the production I think is fine. It's not the most extensive episode in terms of sets and all that, which is fine. It's mostly because done as a fairly cheap one, it seems. The set and the CGI at the end of the universe planet being the only real effects of the episode, and that's not a problem. The rest of the locations are pretty good. The children's home was a good location scouting, as it definitely gets across the right atmosphere. Tad unsettling, but nevertheless familiar. I also like that in many ways it's a very subdued production, which helps with the atmosphere and tone they were going for. The monster has no effects for it, which is good. It should be ambiguous it even exists, and the presentation helps that. The music is certainly lower key than you'd usually expect from Gold, and generally the whole thing is kept at that subtle level, which is good, as this is supposed to be about what you don't know and how things don't always exist and all that, and well, shouting that out in typical over-the-top New Who fashion would have been a mistake. As for the script, this was actually straight up written by Moffat, and this may be a good time to talk about something quickly. I think one of the problems with the series is that Moffat wrote too much of it. These kind of mid-series episodes, I don't think these should be the responsibility of the showrunner. Yeah, I know, RTD sometimes did and sometimes does it as well, but I'd give the same response that I think it gives too much responsibility to one person. Not just because it means they have less time to focus on developing the overall storylines and actually, running the show, but also because it means that too many ideas and stories have to come from one person, and one person is just not going to be capable of that much, no matter how talented they are. Personally, I think the showrunner should write the openers and the finales, and they should simply brief ideas to other writers for the rest of the episodes. Nevertheless, despite that, this is an episode that is the kind of one Moffat could do all quite well with, in theory. There are two main things I think work about this episode, and I think both come from him and his way of doing things. Nevertheless, I also think the things that don't work about this episode, notably everything Clara says or does in it, might have been handled more effectively by someone else, and why I ultimately think this episode might have been better if that had been precisely what had happened. So take that as you will, but bear in mind that's my position. Moffat did fine with this episode, but someone else might have done even better, with admittedly a very solid idea. Which brings me on to the first of the two main things I like about this episode. It's got a very solid idea as its basis. While it admittedly does feel a bit like something Moffat came up with while high, what if, it could always hide, man? I do actually really like the idea of this creature that, wow, it can always hide, that's its natural state. It's a really interesting idea and a really subtle idea, especially because it very wisely has kept entirely ambiguous as to whether this thing even actually exists or not, whether the Doctor has hit upon something important or whether he's just pulling it out of his arse. New Who is usually about as subtle as a bulldozer, and this series in particular had over-the-top clockwork cannibals, an over-the-top Dalek episode, and over-the-top Robin Hood bullshit so far. So to go with something so low-key and almost psychological in its aspects, I think is a very refreshing change. Again, it's kept deliberately and wisely ambiguous as to whether this is a real creature, or simply just a figment of the imagination, and this allows the audience to draw their own conclusions, which again I really like. It's a refreshing level of intrigue that New Who does not often go for. This is the thing that keeps the idea itself from becoming another over-the-top New Who one, as you can just imagine them trying to actually find the perfect hiding machine and how over-the-top and silly that would have become. But no, this instead becomes a question about what's real and what isn't, and how much you can trust your senses and your instincts, and how fear may be influencing them. Now, the Doctor seems fairly sure that this thing is real, but one of the things I actually like about the ending of the episode is that he is actually basing this, the grabbing of the foot, was actually something Clara was doing the whole time. Oops. So, the Doctor's basing this on a lie the whole time as well? But I do like this as essentially an episode that asks more questions than it answers, which as I've said is a refreshing degree of subtlety and obviously not something New Who does often. A nice easy answer ending with a defeat of the monster as you usually get, this ain't, and that I think is a major positive in this episode's favour. The other thing I like about this episode is this scene. Well, I guess you could expand it to say the presentation of the monster as it may or may not exist throughout the episode, but this scene is the only time it's actually really effective. But that's fine as this is really effective and it's all it really needs. It's funny because the build-up is actually pretty bad. Clara turns up at Child Danny's room and has some really awkward interactions, clearly written by someone who has no idea how to write conversations with children, while the Doctor tries to make the scare out of the night attendant's coffee. And fails. But once the creature on the bed appears, everything changes. The first thing I like about it is that we don't see or hear it come in, something which adds a degree of supernaturalness to it. But ultimately it doesn't really mean that much if we think about it. Clara not noticing it entering could just be she was distracted by being annoying, as she often is. We don't get the only funny joke of the whole episode, and yeah, I can imagine the Doctor reading through the collected works of Tolstoy and getting frustrated he couldn't find Wally. But again, I think it's one that actually kind of adds to it, funnily enough. It's not a laugh out loud joke, it's sort of a you have to think about it joke, and I think that does actually add to the atmosphere. The rest of the scene involves them turning around from the creature, the Doctor making some interesting and honestly quite poignant observations on the nature of fear, which is interesting because that's what the ambiguity of this is about really, whether you're giving into the fear and making something scary out of something innocuous. Fear turns some bored child having a prank into a terrifying monster. As they turn around, it also means the audience is in the dark as much as the characters, and this is enhanced by some clever directing from McKinnon, particularly when the creature removes the sheet. Maybe it's just a child taking it off, or maybe it's a creature the convenient defocus is stopping us from seeing. Again, I like that we're so close to finding out, but not quite. It is left to the audience to decide, and that's always a good thing. Ultimately, this is a great scene. It's really tense, full of intrigue, and yet it comes with enough to think about as well. Ultimately, this scene I think makes the episode worth it for me, and that we get this one moment where the true potential of this premise gives us the tension and intrigue I think you'd expect from it. Unfortunately, that's sort of where the good ends for me, as while the rest of Plot A isn't bad or anything, it's quite clumsy in a lot of places. I can't remember if this was the first time the TARDIS telepathic circuits were used or not, but it was certainly the first time they were used extensively, and to me it's a very plot convenience kind of thing to introduce. Oh, suddenly the TARDIS can be controlled by someone other than the Doctor using their mind! Something that I'm sure would never have come up before. It's like when they randomly added new abilities to the TARDIS in the late 60s and the early 70s and never came up again. Like, for me, the telepathic circuits fall into the same category as the time scanner. Shit that was a convenience for one episode and was cast aside without really thinking about the implications of it. Or in the late 60s when they introduced the HADS, this thing that would displace the TARDIS when it undertook damage that would destroy it, and then a few seasons later made the TARDIS indestructible anyway. That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And it just ask questions that just shouldn't be asked. Why would a TARDIS need a pilot at all if you can just stick your fingers in it and fly it to thinking there's no place like home or whatever it is? Surely that would have fucked the Doctor and Fought to Doomsday last time if Tegan could have just done that and took the TARDIS back to Earth, wouldn't it? The rest of the plot also does kind of lose the really good suspense and tension aspects of it. While it never surrenders the ambiguity about the nature of the creature, which makes it so effective in that respect, the Doctor's buggering about the end of the universe just doesn't have the same punch at all. It seems like it's trying a bit too hard, to be honest. Like the bumps in the night bit, yeah, that's just losing any subtlety if you ask me. Ultimately, I'm not sure what future time traveller Danny had to do with anything. It feels like it's maybe the show Clara what future Danny could potentially have with her, but like, Moffat clearly was not thinking very far ahead when he wrote this, given Danny's later story in this series. And frankly, the idea of the Earth having time-travelling experiments only a few hundred years afterwards just contradicts everything we know about the history of Earth in Doctor Who, but sure, whatever. And hasn't the Doctor been to the end of the universe so many times now that it's just becoming laughably contradictory? At the end of the universe, there's absolutely nothing. Oh, except for all the future kind and, Maisie Williams, but apart from that, there's nothing. I feel like the very solid middle of the episode just sort of ran out of steam under the face of a constant barrage of bullshit from the B-plot that just sucked the focus out from it. I'm not even sure any of this stuff is bad per se, it's just a step down from what it could have been, and not enough to rescue the episode from everything else. Speaking of which... Look, you all know I don't like Clara. I've made that abundantly clear every time I've reviewed an episode she's been in, and I don't think there's a great deal of point in repeating myself unnecessarily, but I don't like this character. I think she's...
I'm a bit tricky. Sometimes a bit up myself.
I'm sorry.
Also, I mouth off when I'm nervous, and I've got a mouth.
Yeah, pretty much. Thanks for helping me out there, Clara. But, well, she is the companion here, and as I said at the start, you wouldn't be able to fill out plot A on its own, and surrounding plot B with the companion, I don't think that's fair game. And, again, I'm just not against it in theory, I'm only against it in practice. Okay, it's Clara, maybe a bit in theory, but you get the idea. Problem number one is that the decision is taken to intersperse this episode with Clara goes on a date, and with Stephen Moffat at the typewriter, this goes more or less as you'd predict. Every fucking TV sitcom date cliche is trotted out, and he's completely straight, and it is exhausting. This leads on to problem number two, which is that we learn absolutely nothing about Clara's character doing this. We learn that she's self-centered and likes being in control and is incapable of knowing where to shut the bloody hell up, but we knew all of that already, funnily enough. It's not about her changing and growing because of it. She's exactly the same at the start as she is at the end. All that changes is she learns how not to piss off Danny by saying stupid things to him, and that's it. The experiences don't change her. She doesn't learn to conquer her fear or to accept that things aren't always as they seem, or hell, there aren't always answers to everything. But none of that is there. If this felt like a journey she was going along, then I'd be a bit more accepting of it. But because of the total absence of an arc of any kind, it just feels like diversionary filler. It's just Clara being Clara and not changing at any point because of it. Problem number three is that Clara has about as much chemistry with Danny as she does with, say, a desk or a chair, or maybe like a cupboard or something. I don't get any real connection between these people at all, or any reason why he should be so special to Clara other than they're on a date that we clearly see didn't go very well. They don't connect over anything other than, working in the same place. I don't feel like there's anything deeper to it. I don't know, maybe it's the actors. I don't think either of them gives particularly good performances here. Coleman in particular really struggles with a lot of this material, I find, but frankly I don't blame them. Or I don't blame McKinnon, the director, for that either, for what it's worth, because what's there on the page for either the actors or the director to work with here? We're basically being told there's a connection between these people. Enough that we follow Clara's relationship with Danny throughout the episode, but without ever being really shown this connection. It's quite a simplistic view of things, frankly. Oh, they argued and bickered and clearly showed they have quite some important issues they need resolving, but they love each other really, based on the fact that the episode is telling us that and not really much else. Problem number four is that, well, perhaps this is cheating a bit because it's based on information we don't learn until later in the series, but I'm allowing it on the basis that Danny's reaction to Clara's joke about killing children, which sort of makes sense in context, but it's still pretty concerning for teachers to be doing, never mind, is an important part of the reason they're arguing and is clearly meant to be seen in retrospect as something important because of what we learn. Danny Pink is a war criminal, And I don't mean, oh, anyone taking part in the war on terror is a war criminal by default view, that some people have. I mean, if you just go flat out by the rules of war as they are written down, he is a war criminal. He opened fire without properly identifying his target, which led to the death of a civilian. That is a war crime. He is a war criminal. It is not an oopsie I feel bad about it kind of thing. It is straight up negligent behaviour leading to avoidable civilian death, and he should be in a military prison following court-martial, not out and about in society and fucking being a teacher working with children. I'm not sure what on earth Moffat was thinking with for this, because so much of this series revolves around there being sympathy and connection towards Danny, but I'm sorry, I don't have because of this. I'm not sympathetic towards his trauma that results in the argument with Clara. Oh, don't bring up killing children as a joke. That opens up this old wound. Oh, poor you. If only you hadn't recklessly opened fire and killed that child. Fate is such a cruel mistress. What a fucking arsehole. I'm not going to go too deeply into this because there will be plenty of future opportunities to discuss this in more detail. Most notably the finale of this series, which I'm considering doing fairly soon because, Jesus Christ, what a fucking mess. So, yeah, I'm not going to dwell on that too much here. I don't want to make this a long episode. But this relationship is built on a connection that doesn't exist with a character that I think is a monstrous war criminal. Is it any wonder why I don't think it's very effective? Anyway, so this entire plotline is a complete waste of time, and it's unfortunate because... Well, it's unfortunate because it drags down the surrounding material, which has a great deal of promise, which this shit does not. Anyway, two more things I want to touch on. One fairly minor and one quite important. Firstly, the Doctor's characterisation, I feel it's like a bit off in this. Now, I get this is only Capaldi's 4th episode, and characterisation could take a little while to properly stick, so I should be a little more forgiving than I am really, but here's why I'm a little hesitant about that. Firstly, this feels less uncertain and more just like, kind of completely wrong. The beginning of the episode, I think, is a perfect example of this. The Doctor turning up, humorously misunderstanding human relationships, and flapping his hands around while explaining exposition quickly. This is less not settled yet and more they're just reusing the 11th Doctor stuff. And not the good 11th Doctor stuff Matt Smith was really good at, the bad 11th Doctor stuff that was just pained. And it's even less in Capaldi's wheelhouse than it was in Smith's. Secondly, so much of the episode is reliant on the Doctor's character and his connection with the events as they unfold. It does have its moments, the bits I previously mentioned in the young Danny's room, where he talks about fear, then convinces him and Clara not to turn around. That feels very 12th Doctor, and Capaldi does it very well. Equally, I actually do like the bit at the end of the universe where he decides he has to know the nature of this thing no matter what the risk. A very doctory idea that I think works okay, but there are equally as many times where he just needs to be playing zany for the sake of it. It's not even bad necessarily, I think overall the Doctor's part in this works okay, it's just very inconsistent. The second more important thing I want to touch on is the ending. After the shenanigans at the end of the universe, the Doctor arrives in one more place. A barn with a child sleeping in it. And if this looks familiar to you, well yes, that's because it's the barn that would later be used in Hellbent, because yes, this is the Doctor as a child on Gallifrey. Now, I will give the scene this, in terms of the plot, it is necessary because Clara needs to grab the Doctor's ankle as a child to plant this idea in his head in the first place. And even with that in mind, I really disagree with the inclusion of the scene and its existence as a whole. I think it's meddling in things that shouldn't be meddled with, and the payoff is not worth it to justify its existence. First of all, I think it's a serious mistake to put in anything that kills mystery in the mythos of the show, and this definitely qualifies. But the Doctor having parents who are calling to him to come in from camping out, and essentially telling him to go to his room when you boil it down, that removes so much mystery and intrigue from the early years. It removes from our hero when you can imagine his parents telling him to eat his greens, and unfortunately that's the impression that the scene gives. Secondly, I don't want to know anything about the Doctor's earliest years, and frankly I think it's unimportant to know. He didn't become the Doctor in these times, it would just be filling in the gaps for its own sake. Frankly, I don't think there's any reason at all to talk about anything pre-Unearthly Child, with only in my view 2 exceptions. Exploring the Doctor's relationship with the Master, and exploring the Doctor's relationship with Susan, and why it was her out of all his relatives he escaped Gallifrey with. Those are the only 2 things I think are worth learning. Anything other than that is just diving into questions that don't need to be answered. That's ultimately where my main objections to the Timeless Child comes from. I don't think we need to learn any mysterious origin story for the Doctor. Why does the Doctor need one? While this is much less high stakes than that, and is ultimately a low-key moment in the Doctor's life, I ultimately still don't want to know about anything about what might have gone on around this time. I don't want to know his motivations as a child. They're not important. It was how he was in an unearthly child and how he grew from that is what made the Doctor. Thirdly, it is typical Moffat arrogance that the person who goes back to inspire the Doctor as a child is, of course, Clara, everything is about me, Oswald. Because of fucking course it is. Why do you think for a moment there was even a possibility it could be anyone else? And finally, it just opens up a whole can of logic worms. The main thing for me is that I thought Gallifrey pre-Time War was time-locked. You can't time travel back to pre-war, that was part of the reason why we couldn't go to Gallifrey back in the RTD era. Yes, I know Gallifrey was saved, until it wasn't again because these writers can't learn when to keep these ideas to themselves, but all that was removing Gallifrey from the final moments of the war and placing it somewhere else. That wasn't changing anything that happened before then. Because if the time lock is broken, that's a pretty big fucking deal, right? That means all the scary shit RTD pulled out of his arse for the Doctor's speech in the end of time can make its way through. I mean, at least we might find out what a fucking meanwhile is, but anyway, they're back on Gallifrey, which Clara decides never to tell the Doctor, who you might remember is desperate to find out where he sent Gallifrey to because obviously he wouldn't know, don't be ridiculous. Yeah, just in case you were finding Clara too likeable in this episode, she decides to keep knowledge of where they were to herself, entirely on her own initiative, despite knowing how the Doctor wants to fight Gallifrey again because, I don't know, it's important he doesn't know or something, I don't know. Yeah, I know it's where Gallifrey would have been originally, not where it is now, I get that, but surely it would have had some useful information as to where it could be now. Something for the Doctor to work with? Well, now he'll never find out, will he? Thanks, Clara. My biggest problem with the scene, though, is that ultimately I think it's just unnecessary. We don't have anything added thematically or through character to the plot or whatever. It just feels like that one circle with Clara grabbing the ankle that ultimately is an okay addition, but I think it could just done without. I think the idea of the Doctor being sure of it because of his own character, I just think that would have been fine. I do think this ankle thing adds something to it, but not enough that I could have done without it. But throughout the rest of the episode, nothing really suggests we're leaving here, or that this particular episode is better without a presence of it. If you're going to open this can of worms, I suggest being sure it's a good idea, because ultimately I don't think it was a good idea to fuck around with the lore of the show for so little a reason and for so little a payoff. Anyway, I think I made my point. Ultimately, this is a very frustrating episode. There's a lot to praise about it, a solid central idea, some very interesting execution of that idea, and there's a lot of tension and intrigue, and it is a good use of its central premise. But the irrelevancy is dragging it down, the entire Clara plot, random logic questions, and an ending just wasn't needed. It just drags it all down. I want to like this a lot more than I do, but ultimately I think it's just quite representative on the Moffat era. A very good idea, but it should have been handled so much better, and well, we come back to my earlier point, perhaps it should have been handled by someone else. Taking that idea and that premise and then making something more of it. Maybe it would have been better, maybe it would have been worse, but at least it would have been different, because ultimately I think this episode's biggest sin is it just stands in with the crowd of this series and this era too much. It's another episode that gets bogged down by annoying Clara plots and stupid irrelevancies. And that I think is a shame given the potential that was on display for so much of this. So, I have thought long and hard about this, but I've decided to give this episode a final score of 5 out of 10. I'd say it's typical of the quality you'd expect from New Who. Maybe you think that's a bit harsh, after all it's the same score I gave Time Heist, an episode with far less interesting things to say than this one, but ultimately I just felt frustrated and unfulfilled by the episode. Undoubtedly it's got a great idea at its core, there's so much just smart and interesting about it, but sadly my dinner with Andre the War Criminal just ruins it. I was excited at the bedroom scene, feeling really positive about how well it was working with the tension and the excitement, and then we got to the next date argument between Clara and Danny, and I wanted to stick my head in a bucket of toilet chemicals. An episode like this where the premise is so open and on display but is never quite reached, honestly it's just draining, and because of that I just can't bring myself to say it's above average, even for New Who. Perhaps it's unfair and the good stuff in this episode deserves better, but unfortunately life sometimes isn't fair, or at least my scoring of Doctor Who isn't.